evening. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to everybody who's looking online. Hello. I'm Alan Rusbridger. I'm chairing this event. I'm the editor of Prospect magazine, which is upstairs. My job, first of all, is to welcome you all and thank you for coming out on a rainy night. We're delighted to be doing this with Nesta. Some of you will have seen that the magazine supplement that we did with Nesta, looking at all kinds of prognostications about the future. Your role this evening is to be the minister. So at the end of this, you're going to be required to vote on a proposition. So that will test whether you're paying attention or not. And the first test of the evening is whether the technology is working, because we want to beam in Nesta's Alex Burns.
Hi, and welcome to those in the room and online to the third episode in our Minister for the Future event series. I'm Alex Burns, I'm the Director of Discovery at Nesta. In the last episode, we welcomed James Plunkett and a panel of experts to talk about why we need to act now to tackle tech monopolies. And we're delighted to be back again to welcome you all to today's event, where we'll be delving deeper into the role of geoengineering technology in the fight against climate change. For those of you joining for the first time, last year, Prospect magazine and Nesta started a unique experiment. We imagined a minister for the future. A host of technologies, social trends and geopolitical shifts are coming over the horizon. How do you anticipate those challenges, prioritise and respond? We brought this idea to life, assembling world-leading academics, business leaders, scientists and campaigners to fill up our hypothetical Minister for the Future's red box with bold ideas that looked beyond the challenges of the present and into the future. Those ideas were published in a special supplement for Prospect magazine last December. Whilst far from comprehensive, we felt that those themes offered a cross-section of the kinds of trends, technologies and cultural shifts which will loom large on the policy-making horizon in coming decades. Beneath the concept, though, lies a serious point. Political attention is fixated on managing the present, and despite recent slogans about long-termism, political discourse on the left and the right is often backwards-looking. Here at Nesta, we're focused on designing and testing long-term solutions to society's biggest challenges, from net zero to childhood inequality to public health. Our work around Minister for the Future delves into the wider forces that are set to change our society, economy and the environment in ways that might impact those challenges that sit at the heart of those missions. For its part, Prospect has always championed bold ideas, especially those that cut across the political divide, and that is exactly what Minister for the Future is about. In this event series, we've been exploring in depth some of the themes and ideas our contributors have proposed, and in tonight's discussion, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sir David King and our expert panel of speakers to delve deeper into the world of radical climate repair. I hope you enjoy it.
So as Alex said, we're going to begin with Professor Sir David King. So David, do you want to come up and sit in the one chair away from me? And the format is that David's going to speak first. I'm going to talk to David, and then we've got an amazing panel sitting in the front row here who will come and I don't know what they're going to say. I don't know whether they're going to throw rotten tomatoes at David or toast him, but in some way they're going to respond to what David said. And first of all, we have Gaia Vince there, who's the author of Adventures in the Anthropocene, for which she spent 2.5 years traveling to over 50 countries, it says here, to map the ways that humans are changing the planet. She's also a journalist and an honorary senior research fellow at University College London. Alice Bell is head of policy at the Wellcome Trust, where she works extensively across climate and health within academia, civil society and the private sector. And in the middle here is Akshat Rathi, an award-winning sector senior climate reporter for Bloomberg News, who he tells me have 30 people working on climate, which is astonishing. And he's also the host of Zero, a weekly climate podcast for Bloomberg Green. And as I say, once you've heard from the panel and from David, you will be the minister. And if all our technology is working, which it did last time, and assuming you've got a mobile phone, you'll scan a QR code and you'll vote on the proposition about what sort of policy we should be taking forward. For those of you that are watching this online, Please join the conversation in the comments box, and we will try and take some questions from you if you can put them in the chat. There are closed captions accessed via the LinkedIn live stream, but we're going to start with Sir David. I think the best way of starting, David, there's this proposal which is on the table to refreeze the Arctic. In 10 minutes, tell us what you mean by that, how practical it is, and blow our minds.
Thank you. I think what I actually want to start with is just when I was Chief Scientific Advisor, I developed an in-depth foresight process, and we looked at 8 different challenges over an 8-year period, each challenge involving experts brought in mostly from this country but also from overseas. And I just wanted to say that in 2006 we produced a report which was the biggest program I attacked, which was on infectious diseases and how this would work out over the coming 80 years. And we predicted in our report, which still sits on the Government Office for Science's website, that there will be a pandemic. We described the pandemic that happened in fine detail. We brought in scientists from Africa and China in particular, because we believed that's where this pandemic would arise from, where people were in close contact with wild animals. You buy a wild animal, you keep it next to you until you're ready to eat it, otherwise it'll just not be ready, it'll be bad. So I'm just saying this because I was more or less a minister for the future. I was looking at a whole set of projects, not just climate change. Climate change was the most important. And I regret to say that ministry, as it were, has disappeared. Now, quickly to your point. Climate change is occurring in a way that is dramatic today. So we can't really ignore the fact that it's happening. We have these extreme weather events occurring around the world, and the origin of these extreme weather events is very largely what is happening in the Arctic Circle region. So let me leap straight into it and give the reason why we need some new technologies to be developed to create time, so that we can manage to deeply and rapidly remove emissions, reduce emissions, and also remove excess greenhouse gases that I'm going to say are already in excess today. So the Arctic Circle region is heating up at 4 times the rate of the average for the planet. And the result is that today, while the planet is not at 1.2 degrees centigrade, which is still the figure that's broadcast around, that's the average over 2010 to 2020. Today we're at 1.32 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. The Arctic Circle region at 3.1 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial region for that region of the world. And the result is dramatic for the whole world. The first thing is, if we have the Arctic Sea exposed to sunlight, which has happened relatively slowly but now more quickly, as that Arctic Sea is exposed, it absorbs sunlight, and the ice over it for 1 million years past has been reflecting it back into space, guaranteeing that the North Pole was a very cold region. The Earth spins, and as a result of its spinning, we do have a very strong wind between the cold air in the Arctic Circle region and the tropics. And that wind, the jet stream, was virtually circular, and it's a strong wind, and so it was very good in keeping this function going. Now imagine that during the 3 polar summer months, there's warm air above the North Pole region, not freezing cold. On the Climate Crisis Advisory Group that I chair, this global group, 11 countries represented, only 16 members. One of our members was Tero Mustonen from northern Finland. I spoke to Tero in mid-April 2021, chatting. What's the temperature there? He said, it's bloody cold today. It's minus 30 degrees centigrade. I said, what? He said, no, normally it'd be minus 10. Tomorrow it may come down. it may warm up. I spoke to him at the end of July 2021, so we've now got the polar summer. What's the temperature today? He said, you better be sitting down, it's plus 32. So this is the warm air, so you measure temperature above the surface of the permafrost where he lives, and that warm air was giving plus 32. That's a 60 degrees centigrade temperature rise in a few weeks. So what is happening there is now not only impacting on that polar region, but it's massively impacting on the whole world because that jet stream is now severely distorted. It started meandering and now it's severely distorted. Warm air pushing cold air down, and that cold air pushing on the jet stream. But if you do that, the jet stream is going to bend around and let warm air come up. So we all know that in July 2021, the west coast of the whole of America was much, much hotter than ever experienced before, by 5 to 10 degrees centigrade hotter than a previous record. And that was this warm air getting locked in place with a jet stream coming all the way up North American coast, but middle of America was cold and the weather was very unsettled. Earlier that year, Texas had a temperature of minus 16 degrees centigrade. That's this cold air being pushed down. Temperatures right up in British Columbia were found to be the highest on record by a long chalk, 39.6 degrees centigrade. No, 49, thank you. 49.6 degrees centigrade for 2 to 3 weeks. 137 people died in the town of Lytton in British Columbia. This is a very upper middle class town, and then the town was burnt down because the forest nearby caught fire. And so the whole town was wrecked. All I'm saying to you is, who would expect British Columbia to experience a temperature like that, or Texas to experience a temperature like that? The global weather system is in transition because of what's happening over the North Pole region. And I think you can see where I'm going. If we have a policy of reducing emissions deeply and rapidly, much, much faster than we are today, and if we have a policy of removing excess greenhouse gases that are causing what I've just described to happen, and we've recently had really bad news from the Antarctic region as well, if that is happening at the current level, which is excess of 500 parts per million, pre-industrial level 275, and I'm counting in not just carbon dioxide, but methane and NOx gases. If that is happening today, it means we've already put too much greenhouse gases up there. So there's no carbon budget left to burn. That 600 tons, I'm afraid, is not a viable approach. So we need to remove greenhouse gases at scale. Tens of billions of tons have to be removed every year. It's going to take us to the end of the century to create a safe future for humanity. How do we stop what's happening in the Arctic Circle region? We need to refreeze the Arctic during the polar summer months, just the 3 months. That means during the winter period, when the sun has gone down to the South Pole, we get ice over the whole of the Arctic Sea. Let's keep it there by reflecting sunlight away back into space so that a new layer of ice is formed every winter and it's retained through the summer. How would we do this? There are only 2 ways that I think are actually capable of doing this. One is to create white cloud cover over the Arctic Sea, which is what the group that I founded up in Cambridge is now doing as a collaboration around the world. And secondly, it is to put sulfates into the stratosphere and reflect sunlight away, which is what happens when there's a big volcanic eruption. Large amount of sulfates go into the stratosphere, and the Earth is cooled, and sometimes quite dramatically. So there's my reason for doing this. How do we create time? I don't ever use the word geoengineering about what we're doing on white cloud cover. I would prefer to call this biomimicry, because all we're doing is mimicking the way white clouds are normally formed over the oceans. We're creating tiny droplets of seawater, each of which contains a tiny crystal of sodium chloride, of salt, and in that way we know we can create white clouds, or we can turn dark clouds into white clouds. It's an expensive project. If we're running it out at scale, we'll have to have dozens of vessels around the Arctic Circle region and only activate those where the wind is blowing towards the North Pole region, so that we know the clouds are going to end up there. We can't guarantee that, of course. But that's
a fantastically crisp introduction to the evening. So I've seen your videos, and some people in the audience won't. So can you explain, I've seen these sort of magical vessels that create clouds. Can you explain how they work?
So very simply, the vessels that have been designed, but they haven't been constructed, the funding hasn't been there. These have been designed over a period of 20 years. What you do is create a cloud over the ocean of very tiny droplets of water. So you're just pumping seawater through a spray system. And what is being worked on in the Department of Engineering at Cambridge is to create a spray system that produces a monodispersed spray. So you know the size of each droplet you're creating. Don't waste energy to create a whole bunch of wrong-sized droplets. And once that's done, and we're very confident we'll be able to do it, we can also change the size of this homodispersed group so that we can optimize the size of the droplets. Once that's done, we just have a vessel in the ocean. Now, hopefully, we can pick up the ocean motion, the water motion, to create the energy to run these. These would all be operated remotely, and you only switch on those where the wind is blowing in the right direction. Now, you create the tiny droplets, don't shoot them up into the sky. You create them over the surface of the ocean during the sunlit period. The warm ocean creates an updraft of warm air, and the droplets get picked up by the warm air. As a matter of fact, most of the droplets lose their water vapor in this big rush of warm air. And once they hover as a cloud of crystals, they pick up water vapor again, and you've got a white cloud.
How many vessels do you need?
It's in the hundreds. In the hundreds. This is an operation where the capital cost is going to be in excess of $10 billion to create all of these vessels. Of course, the cost will come down once the first one is built, and this is based on the first one cost. We know that we have several shipbuilders who are very keen to get the contract to do this. In Rotterdam, we've got very large shipbuilders there, and they would be very keen to do this. It may be that the Dutch government would step in and help to fund it, because rising sea level is a big threat to the Netherlands. So I think the cost is a big element, but the research costs, at the moment, we are funding ourselves entirely from philanthropic funding. In other words, governments are not stepping in at the moment to fund this. There is quite a good deal of nervousness about this, which is, I think, why we're having this meeting. But I did want to emphasize the importance not only of a global ministry for the future, but every country having a minister and a ministry for the future, because of this focus on the very near future instead of looking at this long-term future.
So the reason you want to do this is to buy time, so that the other bits of the program can kick in of reversing change and so on and so forth. But it sounds as if this process itself is going to take quite a lot of time. So it's on the drawing board at the moment. You've got to get the funding, you've got to build the ships, you've got to make sure that it all works. What kind of time frame are you talking about?
The time frame depends on how much money we can raise, and unfortunately, this is my job, is raising the money. It doesn't come easy. And several funders have come very close to producing the right level of funding to speed it up to maximum speed, and then backed off. If you can imagine a group that has been formed to fund this sort of thing, but their money coming from investors in a business, and the investors feel they don't want to be involved in this word geoengineering. And so I've just been dropped by 2 major potential funders so far. So it is difficult at this point. I think the problem of climate change and what I've just set out for you is becoming apparent, and that has got to be the driver to get the funding at the right sort of level. At the moment, we're talking about 4 years before we're even operating. Where would we first operate? One of the groups we're working with is in Australia, looking at the Great Barrier Reef, trying to cool that down to sustain the Great Barrier Reef. The Australian government very keen and supporting that work. That allows us to work 1,000 kilometres from the coastline of Australia, because that's their extended economic zone and they can set the rules. We can't work in the Arctic Sea without an international agreement allowing it.
You say your funders are put off by the word geoengineering, but is it more than that? Is it that they think this is too fantastical, it's too unrealistic?
I don't think it's the too fantastical, because we got over that. I really think it was the investors who put pressure on the company that was funding this foundation. I'm pretty confident about this, and I can't say who.
We'll get you drunk afterwards. You can tell us later.
Good, I look forward to that.
What breakthroughs are still needed? I mean, how confident are you that all this is going to work?
I think the breakthroughs all need to be made.
Yeah.
The first is to create the right droplet size. The group in Australia are already out there over the ocean, spraying it with a very broad range of droplet size, and it's not proved successful so far. What we need is a much greater degree of sophistication. It really needs to be conducted by the quality of engineers that we do have working with us in Cambridge, but working with us in Edinburgh, working with us. Stephen Salters, the guy who designed the original marine vessel, wonderful marine engineer. We need all of the expertise we can get, but we must have the money. We need to build up a very large team, dispersing the team around the world in the consortium, and getting the top experts to work.
How do you move from the stage you're at, given all the other priorities of COP, to getting this on the kind of political agenda that it needs to get to?
So the priority of COP is very much, of course, delivered by the agreement in 2015, which I was heavily involved with. I was leading the climate negotiations from the Foreign Office. The priorities in the COP are delivered by that first R I gave you, reduce emissions deeply and rapidly. Being in the Middle East has also created a great deal of interest in the removal of excess greenhouse gases, but this is also required for the simple and I think rather misleading program, net zero by 2050. If we wait till 2050 before we're getting to net zero, frankly, we're cooked.
On that note, a big round of applause for Sir David. Thank you so much for setting that out. And now I'm going to invite the other panelists to come up. Why don't we do girl, boy, girl, and come up onto and take your seats. Is it possible to kill this monitor? Because this monitor is blinking on and off in a slightly weird way. Don't worry if not. It's gone again. Don't worry if not. Alice, why don't we start with you? So I've suggested that each talk for 3 or 4 minutes, just responding to what David's idea is, and then we'll open up a discussion. So Alice.
Well, yeah, thank you. I was thinking, listening to you speak about the challenge that we have working in climate change that requires us to be both completely and utterly optimistic about the future, and also to take things seriously, to have quite a lot of despair, and to be quite to lean into the graveness of the situation that we're in at the same time, and that there's it's always a bit of an emotional roller coaster between the two, but it is a necessity is to be able to hold both of those feelings at once, to be able to take it seriously. The other thing I was thinking is that as I'm head of climate and health policy at Wellcome Trust, so most of my day job is thinking about health and how it intersects with climate. But a couple of years ago, I wrote a book about the history of the climate crisis. And I was remembering how old this story is and this discussion is. And when you were talking about, thinking about the Arctic in particular, I remember reading these incredible newspaper articles from, I think, the 40s about this guy who went around trying to get coal dust on ice because they wanted to melt the Arctic. They thought that this might be a really powerful weapon against the Russians, maybe, if you could melt bits of the Arctic. But people were talking quite seriously about what you've reframed, I think, in quite an interesting way as climate repair, all the way through our understanding of the climate crisis as we understand it now, which is basically really since the 1950s onwards. And there was people like Margaret Mead in the 1970s saying, we need to take this seriously. We need to be talking about how it might affect the most vulnerable people in society. And we need to be thinking about how we bring an intersection of social science research and questions of governance alongside engineering and science. And yet we keep having this conversation. And so maybe we keep having ministries for the future. We keep having projects like the one that Margaret Mead did in the 1970s and this one, and yet we don't quite get there. The other thing I should say, because I am contractually obliged to say this, is that we do need to think about health in this. And that, again, with my historian's hat on, the climate crisis, since it arrived on the political sphere in the mid-1950s, so Congress was first briefed on this thing that we would now call the climate crisis in 1956 by a guy called Roger Revelle. And he was a geophysicist from California. And he was trying to get money to set up a research lab to count how much carbon dioxide there was in the atmosphere. So sometimes you said parts per million earlier. So this thing, when we talk about parts per million, how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere. The data for this comes from a lab in Hawaii that was set up in 1956 because Roger Revelle went to Congress and said, there's this thing you gentlemen should be, and they were gentlemen, you should be worried about. And he was a geophysicist, and he framed it as a geophysical problem, which in many ways you framed it as such a beautiful bit of science that you took us through. But it was very much looking at it as a geophysical question and an engineering question. And that is how we largely still see the climate problem. I think in the last few decades, we've increasingly seen it as a financial question as well, and thinking about weighing up greenhouse gas emissions greenhouse gas emissions and the financial dollars on another side. But what I think we need to get to is also thinking about human lives. Because we know that climate change hurts. We know that it kills, but actually we don't really think in precision about who it hurts and who it kills. And we need to be thinking about both that and the health impacts of all of these different technologies, and whether that's the more dramatic ones that we're talking about today, or even just thinking about where we situate a wind turbine. We are going to be tasked in the future, this ministry of the future, with making some really difficult decisions about weighing up costs and benefits, because there isn't going to be a single win. It's going to hurt some people, and we have to think about where that risk lies, who is going to be put at risk. And we're not going to be able to make those decisions well without health. So I guess my main response to this is, I think if we're going to have this conversation, we are going to need to invest in some better health research and embed health research in our climate policy decision making, because we won't have a proper idea of the problem, and we won't be able to assess the risks and benefits of solutions like this until we do that.
That was very crisp, and it was exactly within our 4-minute envelope. So well done. You've done this before. Akshat.
One way for me to be able to think about interventions to try and tackle climate change is to go through a set of questions at the start. The first question, which in a way we don't have to answer right now, we are talking about a minister of the future. And so we are expecting that we are thinking in the long term, which currently we aren't really. So moving on from should we do something about climate change, we all agree we must. There are three questions that need to be answered. What can we do about it? Whether we should do the one thing that you've chosen, and how can we do it? So David's point is we do need to try and refreeze the Arctic because it will allow for time. So that is the what we want to do. But as soon as the what, which is very eloquently answered on the science, on the ways in which doing it will be beneficial, the other two questions are so much harder to answer. And from Alice's point, because we have been seeing it as a geophysical problem, also not just as a geophysical problem, but for a very long time, climate science was, and even today is majority run by developed countries, the perspective of why these interventions should come at all, if they're not addressed from all perspectives, we won't be able to answer the second question, which is whether we should do it. And so let's forget geoengineering. It's a term that is, used as a political football to try and rubbish ideas that are pretty reasonable to talk about. Let's also not label it a radical idea. We need radical ideas, right? The fact that we are able to cover the planet now in solar panels was once a radical idea when we didn't know that we would be able to capture the amount of solar energy that we can today. So to call it a radical idea or geoengineering and not consider it seriously is wrong. But to answer whether we should do it, the forum, which is a broken forum in one way, COP meetings, is an important forum because it's the only place where lots and lots of developing countries have a voice. And if you're not able to convince them that something of this kind should be done, then the how can we do it gets even harder because who is going to pay for it? We, as Sir David has experienced, trying to raise money for even research is hard. Trying to raise the money that has been promised by developed countries to developing countries in climate finance, a large sum in one way, $100 billion, relative to what you want, very small, but relative to the $4 trillion that need to be invested, quite small, is not being met. So to assume that a government, any government, be it Netherlands, will pony that money up is hard. But if you can convince more people that this idea is worth backing, then there is a chance that it may be funded. And so coming back to whether we should continue studying this, 100%. I feel like geoengineering is taken as this idea that should never be talked about because there's a moral slippery slope that you may take because if you do this, you're not going to cut emissions. But if you look at progress from Paris Agreement, we were on a track for 4 degrees Celsius, 4.5 degrees Celsius warming. We're now on a track for 3 degrees Celsius warming. So there are ways in which we can see progress happen, but those have to happen in this 21st century where we bring everybody along, which seems like a hard problem in a world that's disintegrating.
Thank you, Achat. Also very crisp. Gaia.
Yeah, I agree with most of what has already been said by these distinguished panelists. So in terms of this problem, as David said, we are already at about 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial average. The climate models show that we are increasing, our risk is increasing, and it is a planetary crisis. But again, it's not equally felt, but everywhere will feel the negative impacts of climate change, even while some places will receive some positive impacts. We're already seeing enormous disasters, and what David sort of touched on but didn't sort of develop further is that we are at risk of tipping points. So this isn't an incremental increase in risk. It's not an incremental increase in heat, in agricultural loss, in storms, sea level rise, erosion, all the disasters that we face. We are facing step changes. And, we now have very, amazing computers that with amazing models, but there are some worrying things about this. So if we look at the emissions scenarios which the climate scientists develop, the good news is we're not following the business as usual scenario anymore, which was absolutely devastating. That it 8.5 scenario, which would have been made an unlivable planet by the end of the century. We're also not following the 2.0 emission scenario. We're keeping below 2 degrees by the end of the century. We're not going to do that. We're somewhere between 4.5 and 6.5, these two middle emission scenarios at the moment, which, there's a sort of plume of uncertainty about what temperature we'll reach, because we don't know. We haven't got a crystal ball. We don't know what the emissions will, how our emissions trajectory will go. But we could reach anything, between 2 and 4 degrees by the end of the century, and that is pretty catastrophic. It renders large areas of the planet increasingly unlivable for people, and even though we're not on this we're not on this business as usual scenario, rather worryingly, we are seeing impacts that were not expected. At 1.3 degrees, we're seeing impacts that were not expected until the 2040s or later, which means that it's likely that the climate is more sensitive than scientists thought to carbon dioxide concentrations. That's really worrying. In terms of reaching net zero by 2050, if you look at any of the projections, they all seem to require enormous amounts of carbon dioxide removal, which at the moment we're not, we don't, even with the best plans and all the, Elon Musk's latest gadgets, whatever the box is, we don't have any way of doing this. So they feel quite unrealistic. If you look at any of the scenarios, they either require enormous amounts of land, they're pretty unrealistic. So I would say we are facing a planetary crisis, an emergency. It is being called an emergency, and we need to do everything we can to make the planet as livable and as safe for as many people as possible, and that requires keeping the temperature down. And so we're not talking about it. The reason we're not talking about it in COP is because we're not talking about it anywhere. We need to be talking about the technologies and having these discussions, I think, right now within our communities, within our cities, within our governments, institutions, and that's the way they get raised to the COP level, because we need to start making decisions about what we're going to do about this. Are we going to, we're talking about refreezing the Arctic. This is a planetary problem. I would personally say, from my low level of expertise, I would personally say that sulfates are probably the way to go, even though they are probably less palatable. And we need to talk about this. We need to make democratic decisions about whether or not we're going to use them, under which circumstances. There are no easy solutions. Everything has trade-offs, as Alice said. If we use them, what's the regulatory procedure? How are we going to acknowledge and compensate any negative effects? Who would be in charge of deciding? How would that decision be made? Where would we deploy? How would we deploy? How would we do the research? All of these questions need to be discussed. We need to start the conversation, because otherwise what I see happening is a planetary emergency where the unlivability reaches a crisis point because of the various tipping points. We've already exceeded the tipping point for coral reefs, for example. They're pretty gone, but let's have a look at the West Antarctic ice shelf, the circulation that drives the Gulf Stream, etc. We are on the verge of tipping points. This could get very ugly, and a nation, an actor could decide to deploy this. If we're not making any decision about it, if we decide not to democratically, then what is the alternative? How are we going to manage the alternative of potentially millions of deaths? We already have hundreds of thousands of deaths from climate change related Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I think we need to talk about it.
Thank you. You mentioned...
And I think Wales actually does have a Minister for the Future. I can't remember what it's called, but they actually are quite progressive on that.
They have the well-being of future generations.
They have
Act,
some,
but I don't think they have a Minister for the Future.
You mentioned sulfates, and David, you touched on sulfates. Why? Can you briefly say how sulfates work as opposed to David's scheme, and why?
Because sulfates are just they're just better known. We know that they work because with cloud formation, we do have a lot of seeding of clouds and so on, which is a different sort of technology. So we have some expertise in that. Because to create rain you can do it in a much more, it's much kind of easier to do. In terms of sulfates, we have a lot more knowledge. In terms of the actual technological deployment of sulfates, that's where the problem is. But a very small, we already release enormous amounts of, we are geoengineering all the time. That's why we're in this mess, right? Because we've released loads of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and other pollutants. One of the pollutants being sulfates, and the amount of sulfates we release, which are actually at a lower level in our lower atmosphere where we breathe it in and they cause a huge health burden, actually reducing that. So we already release sulfates, and if we released it into the stratosphere where they would have this cooling effect, it would be an absolutely minuscule percentage of what we're already releasing. And in fact, if you look at shipping lanes, for example, which release sulfates higher up, they have a cooling effect, and some of the heat that we're seeing, the heat waves that we're seeing, have been attributed already to the reduction, which is very good, in sulfate pollution, because it is a huge health burden. So we're already doing that. We're reducing the sulfates, and we're seeing that heating. We're seeing it unmasked.
David, I'll come back to you on the sulfate question in a second, but I just want to put Alice and Akshat slightly on the spot, because you very elegantly dodged the question at the heart of it. So, Alice, you were terrific at introducing, bringing it back to a much more human level, but I didn't quite grasp from what you said whether you would, because the Minister is sitting here wanting guidance from the experts, whether you would actually favour Sir David's plan.
Well, I think the question to Sir David or somebody else in our Chief Scientific Advisor cohort that the Minister might have is, what are the health implications? Because you painted a really good description in terms of thinking about the geophysics of it. But before we have understanding from the health research, I don't think we can make a decision. I don't think we should. And that's not saying I'm putting off the question. I think we can't necessarily do it in this room. I don't have it here, but maybe it is something that you've started to investigate. I'd be interested to know if it's something you've started to think about.
Okay.
I am a bit worried that it's one of the missing points in this
You
area.
very elegantly dodged the question again, but you've asked the question of David, so we're piling up the questions for David to answer. Akshat, you were very good at talking about the what and the whether and the how, but again, I didn't quite hear you saying whether.
I would support research because there are still many questions that remain unknown. And so perhaps, again, this is not trying to dodge the question, because if we don't know the answers to these questions that I'll place now, I don't think we know whether to actually do it at scale or not. Doing the research is completely reasonable. First question is, the idea that it's biomimicry is probably a better way of selling it than geoengineering. But there are many, many ideas that you could call biomimicry that do not work out well. So take planting lots and lots of trees in the boreal forest. That will increase the amount of, boreal forest being in the northern forests in general, that'll increase the amount of sunlight that's actually absorbed, and it'll counter the amount of carbon we absorb from the atmosphere. So you get heating rather than cooling from placing lots and lots of trees in the wrong place. So you could do biomimicry, it could go very wrong. The other question, which I've looked at the science of, the few things that we talked about around dispersal of these salt particles. So far, as you said, the research in Australia has been disappointing. There might be a way to fix it. But the second question around whether it's only a few thousand vessels, whether these vessels can ever run on autopilot as one would hope, those are questions that are still unknowable. We assume that it's possible, right? They're going to have fossil fuels attached to them because we don't have ships that can run on renewable energy. There was an idea, apart from the droplets idea, of putting 10 million wind turbines in the Arctic with pumps attached to them that'll bring up water from the ocean and put it on top of the ice, and that would cool and increase the ice cover, increase it by a meter or so. That's a science paper that was studied, and then that idea went nowhere. The final thing that's unanswered is whether it will work at all, right? I don't know if we have the climate models to actually go through and show whether once we refreeze the Arctic, we actually do buy time. I haven't seen those papers. IPCC hasn't done that work. And so that's because it's not there in the IPCC model. So it's not
IPCC reports are always about 6 years out of date.
They are 6 years out of date, but they're also very much focused on greenhouse gas emissions. They're not looking at repairing climate. So there's an answer that's not been answered by
I think, I know you've been making notes, David, but the questions that I think I've noted are, one, why is your idea better than sulfates? Second, what are the health implications? And third, how can you be so sure that any of this is going to work?
Right. So the first thing is, let me say something about stratospheric deposition of sulfates. I said we know about this from volcanic eruptions. There's been a period in the past, in the 17th century, when an enormous volcanic eruption lost 2 summers in the northern hemisphere. Well, it destroyed crops for a long period of time. So we do know this. We can cool in this way. But there's a big question. We all know about the ozone depletion layer. We call it the ozone hole. And the ozone hole was caused by CFCs entering the stratosphere and destroying ozone. And ozone in the stratosphere is very good for us because it prevents ultraviolet radiation, causing massive cancers in human skin. And my worry about putting sulfates into the stratosphere is what's going to happen to the ozone hole. At the moment, by banning CFCs, we've actually got the hole repairing. Now, I believe what will happen is the ozone hole will get bigger. Now, that's only a belief, and we need to do experiments, but I am not happy that sulfates is going to be a good solution. So I think what I want to dwell on, let's say, the health impacts of destroying the ozone layer, pretty bloody awful, right? So there's no question about that. This is not going to happen. I haven't heard anyone challenge us over creating white cloud cover. That's not the issue. The issue is it feasible? Now, of course, any scientist would tell you, and I can tell you we've got some pretty brilliant scientists at work, you're not posing anything new for us. Yes, of course we know. We have to see that we get no poor effects from what we're doing. We have to see that we can create these clouds effectively. We have to see that we can operate the whole thing so that it actually works. Now, this is why we do the experiments. Right, so I know you were told you
that's why I was supportive of the research. Absolutely.
But I think the point I'm going to make now is actually salting clouds, which is what you mentioned. It has been around for decades, more than half a century. And what are we doing? We actually, I said the salt particles are left. That is seeding clouds. That's what we're doing. It's a very old technology. So we're not working on something that's brand new. We are working on a real forest of work that's gone before. Can I also please add, because I kept my initial statement very brief. Up there in the Arctic Circle region is Greenland. And Greenland is now, it appears, losing ice irreversibly. I say this, that over the last 15 years, a significant net loss has occurred of Greenland ice. Why should we worry about that? There's enough ice on there. Greenland's about the size of Mexico, roughly 1.8 miles of ice over it. All of that melts. Sea levels globally will rise by 7.5 meters, 24 feet. Can we foresee a future for humanity with a 24 feet sea level rise? We certainly wouldn't be sitting here. So this is the challenge to our future. How long will it take? People always say, isn't it going to take a few hundred years? So we're quite happy looking to the past of 5,000, 10,000 years of human development, but apparently it's not right for me to question whether we can please have a few thousand years into the future. Because the other thing is that up in the Arctic Circle region is the permafrost, which I mentioned. Methane hydrate is captured in the permafrost. If all of that was released, as I said, it's already been, did I say it, explosively released in northern Siberia. Enormous craters formed by this explosive release, 50 meters diameter, 60 meters deep, just a deep hole because the methane is blowing up into the atmosphere as the methane hydrates decompose. Is there enough methane there to cause a real challenge for us? If it was all released in 20 years, I say this because the lifetime of methane in the air atmosphere is about 10 to 12 years, half-life. It could be released in 20 years, all of it, explosively, and that would raise global temperatures by what? 5 to 8 degrees centigrade. So we're looking at challenges from the northern area around the North Pole, which is simply massive. I don't see how humanity proceeds if we let that happen. So I'm going to say it's an imperative. If we are going to have a future, humanity, a future, beyond the end of this century. And by the way, sea level rises. The latest detailed computational calculation, therefore not reported by the IPCC, is the country of Vietnam, which is close to sea level, is going to be 85% of the landmass under seawater at least once a year by 2050. That's a very short timeline, 2050. Now, why is that important? A large number of people live there, 100 million, but what perhaps even more important, third biggest rice producer in the world. And where are the other big rice producers? Southeast China, worrying about exactly the same thing. Rice paddy fields close to sea level. Indonesia, where Jakarta, the capital, the northern part of Jakarta, is now permanently under seawater. Right? The city is having to shrink. These two areas are the other two major rice-producing areas in the world. China's now talking about building another Great Wall of China to protect the rice paddy fields. These are enormously challenging projects. So I don't believe that we can be complacent at all about what I'm describing now. We need 4 R's. We need to reduce emissions deeply and rapidly. We need to remove excess greenhouse gases. I believe a safe level is 350 parts per million. And by the way, I wouldn't take it below that because we'll avoid the next ice age if we keep it at 350, right? So there's a kind of optimal level. And the third R is repair the broken parts of the climate system. And so this means refreezing the Arctic in the first place. Then we need to look at the Antarctic. Finally, resilience. Every part of the world needs to look at resilience because we're all going to be challenged. I was in New York for Climate Week and we managed to get into the mayor's office. And what we learned from there is that after the 2012 Hurricane Sandy, which flooded much of New York, they did begin talking about how to defend New York against flooding. And they brought in a very distinguished group of civil engineers, the US Army Corps of Engineers, to come and advise them. And they said, build a wall. It's the only way you can do it. And the wall would have to be 8 foot tall to 20 foot tall around the whole of the city. And the city fathers rejected that. and said, we will think of something else. And this was 2012. 2016, 17 is when the US Army Corps of Engineers reported, and they're still talking about what else they might be able to do. I don't see how you can manage rising sea levels at several meters level without building a wall.
Actually, I can see you itching to get in, but we ought to just turn to questions because otherwise we'll get behind on the evening.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing?
If you make it brief.
I will. Climate Crisis Advisory Group is a group that I chair, and it is a global group. It has a member from Africa, a member who's just died from Bangladesh. Salim. On Sunday died. Terrible, terrible loss to the world. It's got a member from China, a member from India. This is the kind of group where we get buy-in around the world. So I think we need to look at that as a means of looking at these challenging situations.
Do we need microphones, or can we? Yeah, get a microphone to Isabel Hilton, who's here first. Yeah.
Thank you very much. One geopolitical question, one science question. The geopolitical question, you said you would need agreement. Arctic Council currently paralysed because of Russia. Agreement to do this. The Arctic Council currently paralysed. The science question is, I get it about the Greenland ice cap and the permafrost, but the ocean sea ice, given that the ocean has absorbed 90% of the surplus heat, given that we've seen unprecedented ocean heat waves, and given that some of the, I defer to you on science, obviously, but what I'm reading is that it's the ocean heat, which the unprecedented ocean heat is having a big effect on summer sea ice. So do you have any sense of what percentage gain you would get by this project, which is an airborne project?
It is true that there are two elements of heating and melting the ice. And one is from underneath as the sea warms up, but the other is from sunlight. What we are seeing is the melting occurring very much in the solar summer. When the sun has moved up into the North Pole region, the melting occurs very rapidly. Virtually all of the ice formed in the previous winter is actually melted in the first 3 days of the appearance of the sun. So I think the sun is the major element of this. If we can keep that area cooler with cloud cover for the summer months, we are pretty confident the water will also be cooled, but that's all to be discovered.
Do we have any questions online? Yes? Then we'll come back to you for the next question. Yeah, can we have a microphone for the questions online?
So we've got one question from Robert Chris, and I think, Sir David, you just said we need to refreeze the Arctic first, then we can look at the Antarctic, but Robert seems to be wondering if we shouldn't be doing both at the same time.
I think that's a very easy question to answer. Yes. What we hadn't anticipated is what has happened this year. The Arctic sea ice has been pretty stable over the last decade. And then suddenly this year we've lost a massive amount of the Arctic sea ice. So it has become an enormously worrying factor, which means that the West Antarctic ice shelf is more likely to split away and enter the ocean disaster, 1.5 meters sea level rise.
Yeah, question here. And questions for any of the panelists are welcome. Yeah.
I think failure is a great teacher. But I think that the West has failed again and again and again. And as Albert Einstein has said,
why
you
we're not
can't
learning.
keep on tackling the problem the same way and expect a different result. Should we not outsource the solution to the very countries who are affected by this much more than the countries who have actually affected the climate disaster that we are facing? We don't know the answers. Why don't we go to those countries and say that, look, let's work together with you and find the answer. I find it very easy to say, this chapter in Little Prince, one of those books, that we talk about all the percentages and sea level rising and variety of other data that we get together, and yet we don't find a solution. Should we not outsource the solution?
That sounds like
So that in a way that was an intervention I want to make, and maybe the easier way to answer it. If you look at when we are trying to tackle the climate crisis today, we need about $4 trillion of investment in mitigation. We're not even talking about removal, repair, just on reducing emissions. $1 trillion is being spent in developed countries, which is about the sum you have to spend. It's not being spent right, it's not with the right policies, and so it's not going to have the kind of impact we need. $3 trillion has to be spent in the countries that are going to suffer, in developing countries. Right now, that number is about $700 billion. There's a 4-time gap that's not being filled. And if you look at all the solutions that have scaled, they are all solutions that have been directed to some extent by governments, right? Solar panels, lithium-ion batteries. These were shepherded by governments initially, but they've only scaled when there's a profit motive, when there's a business case to be made. Electric cars supported by China, but they're scaling now because there's a profit motive. The trouble with anything to do with removal or repair, or in the COP language, around adaptation or around loss and damage, where you compensate people for the damage that's caused, those don't have business models attached to them, and they don't get funded. So there is even within the business models that can be funded, there's a gap, and developing countries they don't have the capacity. So if we go to them and say, you're going to suffer, we'll do what you want us to do, they'll say, we don't have the resources, we don't have the technologies, we don't have the money. So how are you going to solve the problem?
question here and one here.
Sorry, I can't remember your name, but you said about sulfates. You said the loss of sulfates from shipping has caused a lot of warming because it used to do a lot of cooling because it made clouds, and clouds rain out.
Yeah, I mean, it's related. It's all to do with blocking the, reflecting back the sun. It's albedo effect.
So my question is for Dave, given that it's very well known now that sulfates from shipping make extra clouds that reflect away the sun, how about adding, I don't know if you've got space to add that to your research program, because those kinds of sulfates could be put from UAVs, and they could fly right over the Greenland ice sheet and make clouds.
Totally to be avoided for health reasons.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to be sulfates. There are other ways of doing it as well, and you're a chemist, it doesn't have to be sulfates. There are other ways.
So let me stay with what we're saying. The sulfates are appearing because of burning coal that's heavy in sulfur, and that produces a large amount of sulfate. And this was producing cooling. It's partly cloud generation. It's partly sulfates getting up into the stratosphere. Right. So the effect of sulfates is not arguable, but demanding that we don't use sulfur-containing coal is a very smart move. And the net result has been a big contribution to climate change. It has warmed the planet. I don't believe the solution is to go back to producing sulfates. I really don't. Now, avoid anything that is going to be deleterious to life within the atmosphere that we live in. When we talk about the stratosphere, that's not the atmosphere we live in. We like ozone up there, we don't like ozone down here. So it's all a subtlety that, yes, scientists do work at that level of subtlety. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, putting sulfates in the stratosphere is totally different from putting sulfates in the marine boundary layer, which just can make clouds. They rain out in a couple of weeks. If you put it in the stratosphere, as you said, it gets rid of ozone, it blows everywhere, it traps heat in the poles during the winters as well. But I think I don't want to hog the microphone. But
there's a question here.
Patrick Newman, how do you, to what extent would you think that carbon capture and storage has a role to play in this? And how would you rate that approach to what you're proposing yourself?
Right, this is what I was describing as removal of excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there are some approaches that I am working on. I have a project called Marine Biomass Regeneration, which is an ocean-based project with people from literally around the world working on this with us, with ocean-going vessels doing the experimental work. And this is to fertilize the surface of the ocean with missing nutrients. And we've done an analysis of the surface nutrients across all of the deep oceans of the world. And putting missing nutrients in creates phytoplankton. Phytoplankton then creates living fish, and this whole system can return even the whale population back to where it was 400 years ago. So, and carbon is captured in that process. So I think carbon capture is a key part of our way into a safe, manageable future for humanity. I'm just going to quickly say, direct air capture is not a good way to spend a lot of money. Pumping vast amounts of air through air capture devices so you capture the carbon dioxide in them takes up a vast quantity of energy. And this just looks like a proposal where the cost of energy doesn't matter. Where on the world do we have that situation?
Direct air capture takes about 2,000 kilowatt hours of energy for each ton of carbon, which
Right.
is approximately 6 months of my electricity consumption in a household of 2 people.
Thank you.
Okay, we've probably got time for, yes, question there and two
The British
more
government
questions?
is now
and one here.
installing
Yeah.
direct air capture.
Thank you. How does the effect of these clouds scale? As in, for example, let's say you figure out how to do it and you've only got 10 ships. Is that a significant effect that's worth doing before waiting for investment for all 600
Sorry,
ships?
I'm not.
I think the
hearing-
microphone may not be working.
I think his question is, if you do 10 vessels, is it a good idea can you see any results with 10 vessels before you see 1,000?
Yeah.
What's this
So
rule of scaling?
We of course will start with one vessel. We'll then modify that vessel, I'm sure, until it's working very efficiently. Then we might go to 2. We'll step it up slowly. We're not going to suddenly create thousands of vessels in the ocean.
But do you have a tangible benefit for your end goal just by having a small number of ships?
Will you see a result from 1 or 2 ships?
As in a result
Then
that's
it's
useful for
We
the
will
planet?
certainly get a very, very good picture of the direction of travel from even the first ship, absolutely. We can generate from one of these vessels enough white cloud and then watch the behavior of the white cloud. So I have little doubt that even the first vessel is going to give us very, very important information. I would be guessing though, right? I'm just telling you what I'm expecting.
And one final question here.
I think that microphone needs to be switched on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Hi. Question for the panel. You've raised needing to decide this on a democratic basis, but how would you tackle the kind of misinformation and the conspiracy theories that are already there in climate change, let alone geoengineering, if you're going to call it that? I work in local government, and I've had residents accuse me directly of geoengineering and causing the rain in their area, which is obviously the extreme end of it. But
is that the next 15-minute cities problem for local councillors? Geoengineering. Oh wow!
Is it your fault it's been raining all the time?
Yeah.
Oh,
apparently so.
Well, no, I mean,
at the rain.
it's one of the things that's really interesting from a historical point of view is how much discussions about cloud seeding actually affected early conversations about climate change. And there's one theory that one of the reasons why meteorology as a sector, as a field, contained quite a lot of climate skeptics for a while, was that they got very used to having to spend the 50s going like, no, this is just a conspiracy theory, nobody is changing the weather, this is a conspiracy theory, it's not that dramatic. So when there were what seemed like dramatic questions about climate change, they defaulted to, no, don't worry about it, in this sort of skeptic position. And it has coloured all the way through, and there are deep-seated questions and worries, and some of them are fair, but also all sorts of stories that drum out, and I think it would be very difficult to navigate. But I think one of the things that was important about Gaia's point was it's about having a large democratic discussion about climate change. And we have to that was one of the reasons I was thinking about the health impacts of climate change as well as these interventions. We need to be able to have that right structure to make these decisions within. And if we're having a rich, there's been lots of fear about bringing these things that sometimes get called geoengineering to the public realm, that you even talk about it. There's a line from a guy from Greenpeace once said that it's even thinking about it as an expression of political despair. There's an idea that even if you talk about it, you'll let some genie out of the bottle and it'll start happening and it'll be really dangerous. And I think you need to trust the public to have these conversations, and we need to be having a much richer set of conversations about climate change so that when something like this comes in, 15-minute cities or geoengineering or any other thing, it doesn't have that problem. And so I think the trick for that is to have a better conversation about climate change generally, because we can't shy away from it.
Gaia, right? Do you want to-
Yeah, I would agree. I think we need to have open, honest discussions, and there is a lot of morality within the environmentalist movement, as well as where people form different groups about what is acceptable and what isn't. And I think how I think about it is there's a lot of similarity with health. For example, there was a lot of pushback on giving young children, 12-year-olds or 11-year-olds or whatever, the HPV vaccine because, maybe that would give them permission to then be really promiscuous and have sex and, rather than protecting them from a sexually contracted cancer. And for me, I think, no, have that honest conversation, do everything you can to protect somebody and, take the morality out of it. And I think I'm a bit more pragmatic than that. in that. But everybody has their own opinion, and that's the whole point of democracy, is that, we have to have the open discussion so that we can so that we can come to a point where there aren't sort of siloed, where we don't need to be protected from the truth and from facts. I find that...
one quick one. So this is a question, and just to plug, because it's a moment to plug it, I have a book that's out called Climate Capitalism, and every event, this is one question that comes up. I'm talking about climate solutions in the book, and the climate disinformation question comes up. So there are three ways in which I think about it. One, if there is a global problem that we are doing anything about at any scale, it's really climate change. We're doing something about it despite there being a massive disinformation campaign that ran in the 1990s from fossil fuel companies. And so progress can be made, and if anything, climate change shows that progress can be made. Second, there has never been more journalistic talent or resources put towards this. And we have somebody sitting on the panel, Alan, who's been the force behind making sure that climate as an issue is taken up by journalists. And they've had to learn science, and they've had to learn how to deal with the politics of both sidism, which is something we know from political journalism but doesn't apply to science journalism. So if anything, the climate story is actually a hopeful one for how to counter disinformation. But with technology where it's going, and artificial intelligence and how easy it's going to be to make things up, it's not an answer that we have right now.
David?
Yeah, I think this is a critically important question, of course. And I don't think we should underplay the importance of the disinformation that is getting into our own hard copy media. Let me say, not The Guardian, but I could mention a few other newspapers that we know just carry disinformation. And where does the disinformation originate from? It is from the fossil fuel lobby. Essentially, the United States has a very undemocratic lobby system. Look at the gun lobby, look at the cigarette smoking lobby, look at climate change as a lobby. The fossil fuel lobbyists have been amazingly powerful. They've been putting billions of dollars into trying to rubbish the science of climate change, and in many ways have been remarkably successful. The scars are on my back. When I was negotiating in climate change, for example, when at Gleneagles we had a G8 meeting, Tony Blair was in the chair of that meeting. We have Sherpas who try to settle the meeting in advance, what the decisions will be. And the Sherpas, the 8 Sherpas at that point, it was G8, the 8 Sherpas were told by the Americans, please, the 7 of you, draw up an agreement, and then we'll have the final say. The agreement that was drawn up by the 7 nations was then redlined and left meaningless by that Sherpa from the United States. This was George Bush Jr., and I'm going to say in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. If the United States back in 1992 had taken the leadership role on acting on climate change, we would not be in this really serious position we're in now. And that I'm putting down to the fossil fuel industry.
That's a very good note on which to turn over to the Minister. So the way this is going to work is a bit of technology, geoengineering called Slido. If you're online, you can find the link to the poll in the comment section on YouTube or LinkedIn. If you're in the room, you can point your mobile phone at the QR code that you can see there. And the poll question is, should the UK government now consider unique climate repair techniques to tackle the climate crisis? So has Sir David and the panelists in their different ways convinced you or not? So please vote. You've got 2 choices based on the discussion you've heard. You can explore the geoengineering options, or you can halt the geoengineering options. Because my screen is not working, I have... How do we know when the votes are all in?
You're saying about every area has its own disinformation. I remember any new area I worked in. So I discovered the solar truthers, but then a little bit for climate solutions.
Yeah.
Like when I discovered the heat pump.
David,
and heat pump.
the good news is you have overwhelmingly convinced the Minister
No, but even before
of
that,
the
7
case
years
this
ago,
evening
when there was like
by about 90% to 10, is that
I
right?
didn't have enough energy to have a disinformation.
89% to 11, so this is probably more successful than anything you ever achieved in government. Overwhelming success for your arguments tonight. Thank you to this panel for coming and talking so knowledgeably, so clearly, so concisely. Thank you, David, for coming along and making the arguments. Thank you to the speakers for coming along. You may find a feedback survey somewhere. If not, if there's online and there's the chat box, but there's another QR code, yes, for a feedback survey if you feel like feedback. The next event in this series is on November the 28th of November, where we'll be discussing healthcare in the modern age, why we need a national health bank, with Dame Sally Davis. I'm finally urged to urge you to sign up to both Nesta and Prospect newsletters. And the most important bit of the evening is now to move upstairs and to have a drink and canapes, and I'm hoping you can ask further questions of our panelists if they can stay. Thank you very much for coming.